Welcome back to the Mental Game Podcast. I'm your host, Jared Tendler, joined again this week with my co-host and co-author, Barry Carter.
Hello.
And this week, continuing with the theme of experimenting with this podcast, we're going to do a Q&A. A couple shows ago, I asked listeners to send in some questions and got some great responses. And Barry's going to ask me questions, and we're going to discuss them and see where it goes. So Barry, who's up first here?
Okay, well, you didn't actually send me the names of any of these.
Oh yeah, I tried to keep it anonymous. I didn't.
So we're just going to have to say person A and go from that way onwards. Okay, this is a pretty straightforward one, I think. How do I deal with mistake hate? So I think he or she is referring to mistake tilt. I tried to use deep breathing and injecting logic. But what specific thoughts might I inject? So probably better if you briefly mention what injecting logic and mistake tilt is. But, beyond that, how specifically do you get around mistake tilt?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, okay, so mistake tilt is basically what it sounds like. It's the hatred of mistakes. And injecting logic is just the technique that I use for using thinking to correct an underlying flaw, or in the short term to help contain an emotional reaction to tilt. So you're at the table, you make a mistake, or you think you make a mistake, frustration, anger starts to build, and so you're using the power of your mind to help to contain that emotion so that you can continue to play well. Now, what specific injecting logic statement that you make, or what specific thing that you're thinking about in that time, really has to do with what is the reason that you hate making a mistake. Now, a mistake could threaten your goals. It could make you kind of like, certainly a big mistake could cost you your entire profit in that session, or bust you out of the tournament. So it could be kind of like a lost opportunity. So if you're coming up with a statement in that regard, there's a degree of like expectation that your goals are going to be met without making mistakes like this, right? And it's just anytime that you're going through some kind of challenge, whether it be making a certain amount of money in a given month or in a given session, there are going to be ups and downs, and playing perfect poker through that time period is just not reasonable. So those expectations of perfection, or those expectations of playing without making mistakes, is just not reasonable. So having a statement that says something like, mistakes are inevitable, my job is not to avoid them entirely, it's to minimize them, minimize the severity of them, and to continue to play as well as I possibly can. So that would be an example of an injecting logic statement. But at the end of the day, you really have to make sure that you're understanding why it is that you are frustrated with mistakes. There's a technique that I use in the books as well called the mental hand history. And it's one of the things that I think has been the most underutilized by readers of the book, and frankly even clients of mine until more recently, partially because I didn't realize just how important it was. And I think had I known what I know now at the time that we wrote the book, this section would have been much more front and center and much more prioritized. The mental hand history basically guides somebody to breaking down a problem, and there are 5 steps to it. The first step is to describe the problem in as much detail as you possibly can. You're trying to really just get like a snapshot of the thoughts, the physical reaction. So sometimes you can feel heat in your head, or you can pound the table, or even just kind of like lean into the table. Any like changes in your play would be an example of that. Any specific thoughts that you have in your mind, all of that is in that first step. Then the second step is actually is one that often feels illogical to people, but is really important to try to understand, which is, why does it make sense that you would think, feel, or react or play that way, right? So it's trying to get to the logic behind why it is that this is happening. And this is the step that it's often the hardest for people, because again, it feels illogical that they're reacting this way, but when you can shift your mind to start thinking proactively about why it makes sense that this would occur, then you actually can start the problem solving. So in the example that I gave, it makes sense that you would hate mistakes because you have expectations that you're not going to make them, or you have expectations that you're going to reach your goals without having any problems. So then the third step is really where we start to get to the root of the problem, which is, why is that thought, feeling, or reaction flawed? And in this case, right, it's flawed because mistakes are inevitable. Mistakes are part of the learning process. You can only really avoid mistakes for something that you've already mastered. And poker is so complex, you're not going to master it. You may master elements of it, but avoiding making mistakes entirely is just not practical, or not even reasonable. So then the fourth step is what is the correction? And as I said in the injecting logic statement earlier, that would be the correction. And then the fifth step is kind of a bonus, which is, why is that correction correct? And it's correct because when you're in the learning process, right, the adult learning model, also a concept I talk about in the book, describes the stages of learning. And until you've reached that level of mastery, mistakes are just part of the process.
I think that's a pretty thorough answer. Okay, person B. This is a good question. This is about being able to execute on this person's theoretical knowledge under pressure. He says, while I feel I have a good grasp of theory at the tables, when I'm restricted by time or pressure, I start making suboptimal decisions. How can I get better at making the right plays when it really counts, like deep in a big tournament, for example, when I don't get in these situations often enough to practice? I mean, this is a really good question for two reasons, really. It's like, first of all, it is a very difficult. I mean, most poker players are quite studious and bookish. You know, most of us learn from academic type material, unlike the live players of the pre-boom years. And also, likewise, this guy's right. I mean, you can't replicate a final table. There isn't practice really available quite in that way. So how would you get someone to bridge the gap between what they know in theory and what they're able to execute when it really matters?
Well, I think the part about not being able to practice that situation very often is certainly very relevant, but it's also not unique just to poker, right? There are lots of sports where athletes for the very first time are on a stage where it's massive, whether it be like the World Series, which is coming up in the U.S., whether it be the Wimbledon World Cup. You know, you're going to have players who are going to be on massive stages for the very first time, and they need to step up and perform. So I think on some level, the way that you can do that is, number one, to not out-level yourself, to not try to do more than you believe you're capable of, or not to do more than you're trying not to make plays that you wouldn't normally make. And I think the way to make that simple is to first focus on correcting your greatest weaknesses. Mm-hmm. You know, we've talked about how, like, the main event final table is kind of like a battle of sea games. You know, we discussed this with David Tuckman a few shows ago, and the ability to make your weaknesses really strong is what's going to provide you the foundation to be able to play it at your highest level when you're not in that situation very often.
That's the Michael Jordan kind of thing. He always did that, right?
Yeah, and Tiger Woods as well. I think all great athletes are just driven to make their weaknesses really strong, and that strength at the back end creates great opportunity to excel. So even though you're not going to be in that situation very often, if you're always aware of what your weaknesses are, and you have the corrections of them, you know, practiced and made, like, those are things you can be practicing on a regular basis. Like in your everyday, tournaments, you can be improving your C game, even though you're not under incredible pressure. And so then when you get into a tournament scenario, all you're trying to do is just apply the same kind of practice that you've been doing to correct that C game, just on a bigger stage. And that pressure is real. So now dealing with the pressure is another part of this, right? So there are, there is a technique very similar to the injecting logic process where you're trying to recognize the early signs of that pressure, doing some deep breaths just to kind of ease it back a little bit, and then inject logic to kind of talk your way through it. So, like a lot of things, you've got to figure out what might be amplifying that pressure more than is reasonable. And one thing that I would suggest, because it's pretty common, is that people think that pressure is bad. So if you think that pressure is bad, then you're actually going to feel more pressure because you're going to try to get rid of something that you think shouldn't be there. When in actuality, at low levels, it can be incredibly helpful and fueling to reach your highest performance. You can think about like the nervous system as being a sensory organ, a sensory tool. It's drawing in information. So when you are in that high pressure situation, your nervous system is kind of jacked up. If it's jacked up just a little bit more than is normal, then what you're able to do is have the ability to sense data and information going on within that table that you wouldn't normally see. And that is the essence of being in the zone. It's being able to have access to this very unconscious, subtle data that can fuel some incredibly high-level decisions. So if you can see pressure as a good thing, as something that's helpful, then you might take a big chunk out of the pressure. Now, if that doesn't cover all of it, then you've got to be looking at and trying to understand what else might be going on. Do you have some fears of failure? Do you have some fears of making mistakes? But you are looking sort of in that fear, anxiety realm, because that's ultimately what pressure, or the spectrum of what pressure is.
I mean, the person that wrote in made a good point in that you can't practice these high-pressure situations. But last year, I mean, I think most people know that you had a client in the November 9, York Van Hoof. And I remember he told me he was actually playing in super high roller events, specifically to add pressure and create that kind of almost like November 9 final table experience. I mean, do you think there's any merit to somebody artificially adding pressure to their play? So let's say this person's playing an online sit-and-go tournament. If he perhaps had a side bet with a friend that he'd win the thing just to add that extra element of pressure. Do you think there's any merit to forcing a pressure situation like that? Obviously, within the confines of bankroll management and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I don't, and I wouldn't consider it to be forcing it. I would call it being creative about trying to come up with a way to practice it. I mean, if you're a golfer, right, you have the golf course available to you. There's not really a clean poker practice, because it's not just about having a poker table that you can go and sit down and play. It's like not quite the same way. So you don't have, like, you need people who are taking it very seriously to be able to help you. And I know that you talk about final table practice. Players often do final table simulations, and maybe they put money on it, or maybe just the idea of doing it and what's involved is pressure enough. Maybe having a person come watch you play poker or sweat you if it's an online tournament, or certainly you can do that live too. But having somebody nearby who you're like talking out your rationale to, who might be not threatening to you, but somebody who's gonna challenge you, who's not gonna just kind of take it easy and be somebody who's comfortable to be around. The interview with Jonathan last week, you talked about or he talked about doing the thing that scares you. So yeah. You can be a little bit creative about developing an environment that scares you, even if it's not just a poker one. So maybe it means practicing dealing with pressure situations outside of poker.
That's good. This is a slightly related question from our next listener, actually. Lately, I've been wondering about the connection between mindfulness and the zone. When I've described my experience of the zone in my journal, I've noticed that there's a lot in common with my experiences in meditation. Do you think meditation is clearly a way to play in the zone, or is it likely that the two are connected, or similar things? Is there any actual proof or study that the two are connected? Do you think poker players should practice meditation in order to perform better?
Lots of questions there.
I think it boils down to, what do you think about meditation, really?
Well, and its relevance to the zone. So, I mean, the studies that are about mindfulness in the zone, I would bet that they're out there. I can't think of one offhand, but I know that mindfulness has gotten a lot of mindfulness and meditation has gotten a lot of it's been very kind of a hot topic in research these days. So there's a lot that's out there, and yeah, as I said, I'd be surprised if there wasn't. Now, my take on it is that mindfulness and meditation can help to do several things. One, it can strengthen the mind. Think of it like a mental workout in a sense, where you're strengthening aspects of the mind that are designed to help control focus and attention, and that is incredibly helpful for getting in the zone. But it's not like it's a guarantee, right? The zone is a complex thing. It's not like you can just press a button, like get into a meditative state, and you're automatically in the zone. There is certainly merit to using meditation as part of your warm-up to getting in the zone, and I have clients that do that. But I think the bottom line is that it's not like you can see. Okay, one of the things that people often ask about the zone is like, can you visualize previous instances where you've been in the zone and use that as kind of a trigger to get you in the zone today? And the reason that I don't like to do that for the long term. Now, you can do it for short periods of time, or when I say short periods of time, I mean like instances where you've been in the zone recently. You can use as a jumping off point. But it's not like you want to like visualize being in the zone like a year ago. And the reason is because the zone is something that continues to evolve and change and increase in quality. And that quality is not only just related to your technique, right? You wouldn't want to play like you did a year ago.
No.
And so you also wouldn't want to have the type of focus and clarity that you had a year ago as well. Like, the zone needs to be very kind of present day oriented and representative of what you are like at your current peak. And that peak expands, and so the zone is representative of your current peak. So again, I think if you're looking at something more recently, like a week or two, that you can use as a jumping off point, but you really don't want to be, kind of like pulling together like a composite or, instances of being in the zone for much, much longer in time back than that.
Yeah, cool. Interesting question now from person D. Who's actually a trader. Hi, Jared. My strong point is math, and while you come highly recommended from a bunch of people I respect, I have a problem with psychology in general. Namely, that most of the academic psychology studies that seem to have really small sample sizes. What do you think of that? And I must say, I kind of understand where this person is coming from, because as a poker sort of coming from a poker background, we're used to dealing with sample sizes of hundreds of thousands of hands before we can come to any kind of conclusions about anything. And, some of the psychology studies you see don't reflect that. So I kind of see where this guy's coming from, but you're obviously in the industry, so maybe you have a slightly different view to that.
Yeah, I think the psychological research is like research in lots of fields. There is research that has been replicated, same study been done by multiple people in multiple countries around the world with, different size samples, and when those types of studies that have been replicated like that, and oftentimes they'll do a study about all the studies, and they'll come to conclusions based on all of that data. That's the stuff that I tend to focus the most on.
Yeah.
In fact, actually, there was I think a fairly groundbreaking kind of exposure of lots of research that this person may be referring to that had been proven not to be as reliable as we had thought. And I'm kind of blanking on some of the specific studies, but they were things that were fairly relevant that people had kind of taken as truth. And so when we look at psychological research and the merits of it, I think we have to use our kind of a bit of just logic and I'm blanking on the word here. One second.
Bullshit detection, I think, is probably the key there.
Yeah, but it's more of like what you're.
Skepticism.
Yeah, exactly.
There you go.
I mean, I think we have to be a little bit skeptical of the research. I mean, you can't just take top line conclusions at face value unless they're really confirming of things that you've already believe about the world or are well established. And even then, you still want to have some skepticism. But I think one thing that not a lot of people realize about research is that for a psychological paper to be published, it only has to have 95% certainty that the statistics that are involved to come to those conclusions are actually reliable. Now 95% confidence is pretty high, but it's not 100%. And, I mean, we talk about like a 5% failure rate. I mean, that's what is that, like the equity of a two-outer? I mean, that happens a lot.
Yeah.
So, when you look at the replication of studies, so you take a particular study that's been replicated, let's say 50 times, and you have 95% confidence in the all 50 of those, then you're kind of converging on some certainty that this conclusion is probably pretty accurate. But when you only have one, and the sample size could be 20, with a bunch of college kids who are white, or they're all of a similar demographic, whether it be age or gender or socioeconomic status or whatever. I mean, you're really dealing with some very homogeneous populations that are not really going to be very conclusive to the broad public. And then the other thing you got to look at too is, was this done in a real world setting?
Yes.
Sometimes, they're done in isolation, and I think the researchers that I really respect, and there are many of them, they understand their role. They're not practitioners like I am out in the field working with people. But I rely on the researchers to help to guide me to advanced methodologies or advanced ways of thinking about helping people and working with them, and they rely on me to be some of that bullshit detection, to say, listen, this is not how it's playing out in reality. Despite your conclusions, there are flaws in either the methodology or in the conclusions.
And we've. Interestingly enough, there's a question. The final question for today is kind of linked to that, actually. It's a very short and abrupt question, but do you recommend your clients with mental game problems get medication? And again, I guess that's kind of a psychology industry kind of question. I mean, what are your views on that?
Well, I mean, medication has a purpose. It's a tool. So, I mean, I wouldn't prescribe it. Well, number one, I can't prescribe it. I mean, but I wouldn't suggest that all people get medicated. I mean, the reality is that medication, certainly in the U.S. and maybe in other countries, it tends to be kind of the default mode for people in more the mental health sphere. I mean, I'm dealing with people that have performance issues, and more recently, I think my client base just has kind of naturally expanded out, not only into other areas of performance, but also into some personal realms as well. So there have been poker players that have had personal issues. We've kind of solved the performance ones, and now we're digging a bit deeper. But even in that sphere, they don't have issues that are overwhelmingly like damaging their lives. If they did, I wouldn't be working with them, because most of my clients I'm working with remotely. So it's they're thousands of miles away in different countries or different parts of the U.S. and I don't work with people remotely like that who I think need that kind of help. In fact, I've referred many people who have come to me in that regard to finding therapists who are locally. But in general, I think we have to look at what the role of medication is in recovery, in dealing with mental health issues. And, unless you have like a genetic disease, schizophrenia would be in that category, although even more recently I just saw some research that said that that medication with talk therapy is actually becoming very useful for people with schizophrenia. I mean, I think, we go like 20, 30 years ago, it was lock them up and medicate them, and that was their solution. So, we've gone to we've come from some archaic ways of not only treating people, but treating them mental health wise, to realizing that there's a lot more potential within somebody who has one of the most severe mental health disorders. So that's like kind of the extreme case. But for most people who have maybe some focus issues, or they have some depression or some anxiety that are impairing their lives, you have to think about the end game. Is the end game you on medication the rest of your life? Because frankly, in a lot of cases, especially with ADHD, medication loses its effectiveness over time. And what has happened for some people, I'm not saying all, but for some people who have been on ADHD medication for long periods of time, they have lost the effectiveness of the medication, and so then they're kind of left almost like mentally weakened. It's almost as if they've had, let's say like a brace on their knee that has been helping them walk, and then that brace, stops working, and they realize, well, crap, like my muscles have atrophied, and I'm not nearly as strong, and now I actually have to go and work and to strengthen my muscles. So I think overall, what I think the research has tended to show, again, I'm not going to say this across the board, the research has tended to show that the greatest outcomes come when you're using some kind of talk therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy plus medication, because then you're using the medication as a temporary brace or a temporary crutch to help you in the short term to reduce some of that emotional load, the emotional heaviness, so you can use your mind to develop more skills, to develop more strength internally, to have a better perspective on whatever the situation is you're dealing with. So I think the number one, be a bit skeptical about the use of medication, and don't just look for the easy way out, because the easy way may be temporarily easy, but in the long term, you're actually hurting yourself.
Yeah, I mean, as a pure layman in this sort of space, I've always kind of felt that as long as the issue isn't so severe that it's, debilitating for you, perhaps these are emotions that you should be feeling, given the circumstances, and the healthy way to overcome them is to face them and experience them. I mean, that's probably roughly where you are with those sort of things, just on a broad scale.
Well, yeah, that's a good point, because what you're referring to is like the functionality of emotion, right? That there's a purpose behind it, that you're not just feeling or reacting mentally in a particular way for a random reason. And if you can use your emotions as a guide to deduce and figure out what's going on, that's like kind of mental game problem solving. And when you solve the problem or resolve the problem, right, the emotions disappear, and so thus the need for medication disappears. But I think what is more impactful is that you're actually like learning and growing as a person, having kind of gone through that experience. I mean, not having emotional ups and downs means you're not human. I mean, and there's not a single person on this planet who doesn't have some range to their emotions. And when your emotions are tending towards the downside, and you're in your, quote, like, C game, well, just like you would in poker, or just like you would in any sport or in trading, you aggressively correct your tactical weaknesses. And in this case, you aggressively correct your emotional or mental game weaknesses, and that allows your entire functioning to move forward, and that's the essence of strength.
Excellent. That's the final question, Jared.
All right,
Thanks
cool.
For everyone that sent them in.
Yeah, and I'm impressed with the kind of the range of questions that we got, and this is certainly was enjoyable for me to talk about all this. So if it was helpful to all of you, then please keep the questions coming, and we'll do another Q&A at some point in the future. And some of the topics I mentioned about today are in the Mental Game of Poker 1 and 2, which you can get for free on audiobook. Just go to jaredtendlerpoker.com/free to find out more information about how to get it there. And that's it for today's show. I wish you all very well, and I'll be back soon with another one.